Like you hire people who've worked with only engineers from those companies, and they tend to like
Yeah.
only focus on hiring from those companies because in their mind that's the best they can do, right? But a lot of the
Yeah.
engineers that you want to hire at startups are people who
Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it. I think given that we're here recording this with your tool, why don't you give us an intro of who you are, what you do, and what you're working on at the moment?
yeah, my name is Sunny. I lead engineering at Descript. I've been here for close to 4.5 years. And if I was to describe my career in a nutshell, I started off with the larger companies and very quickly realized that I really enjoy working in smaller environments, smaller teams, smaller projects, 0 to 1 products, and feel like I've been in this loop of joining early stage companies, seeing them grow and scale. And at some point, when they become really big, mostly sluggish, that's when I tend to find a new home. So I was lucky to be part of the early team at Pinterest and then at Dropbox. And then after spending 6.5 years at Dropbox, I found out about Descript and joined them when they were about 15 or 16 people.
I'd love to hear more about the experience at Dropbox. It's so rare that people get to ride an incredible company up like that. So walk us through, like, what did you enter as, what did your career look like while you were in there? And how did you think about your career at each step at Dropbox?
So, when I was leaving Pinterest, I was in a role that I was going back between being an IC and a manager. At Dropbox, back in the day, within engineering, they would never hire managers directly. So, no matter if you
Mhm.
were a VP at a previous company, they always hired everyone as a software engineer, as an IC. And that was an interesting dynamic because it meant that all leaders that we hired within engineering were very technical and got to kind of
Yep.
experience the code base and build a couple of small things before they ramped back up to management. And so I joined Dropbox as an individual contributor. At that time, we were working on a lot of these 0 to 1 products. So I joined a product called Mailbox, which is supposed to be a much more seamless, integrated, really easy to use mail client. And that's what I spent a little bit of time on. I started really enjoying being an IC, and so I stayed in there for about a year. And then the next 5.5 years, I was always going back and forth. So for certain projects that I would be tapped in, I would realize there's a bigger need to be an IC technical lead on the project. So I would stay with that role. And sometimes there was a really great technical lead on the team, and all they needed is a really good manager. And that's where I would step into that role. So Dropbox, we often went back and forth between being an individual contributor and a manager, partially because all the managers were expected to be very technical.
Did you have a preference in the type of work that you were doing, or the positives and negatives for each side?
I definitely like had a bias towards staying technical. Now, I don't think I had a very strong preference in terms of like, do I want to be coding day to day, or do I want to just
Yeah.
like be managing people and helping with all the organizational kind of complexities? But I mostly just wanted to work on difficult problems that are important to the
Yeah.
business. And over time, I've realized I'm a better manager because I can do whatever that needs to be done. And in some
Yeah.
ways, I don't get drained by doing extremely boring things if that's what is most important to the business. Versus I found like a
Mhm.
lot of ICs can find it very draining to take on work that doesn't quite feel as impactful as being able to build a product and see it live in front of users.
A lot of people miss when they move to management that feeling of, hey, I created something today and it's in users' hands and they're using it. But on the flip side, you get more leverage as a manager and you can do that more times for sure. And so what was the point that you decided at Dropbox might be time to move on? Did anything particular happen?
Yeah, I think so as Dropbox got larger and in some ways as I moved up the ranks, the projects that I worked on had much longer time horizon. So the last project I worked on was almost a year and a half to 2 years. And there was a big launch moment, and largely like what it felt like, there were windows of opportunities where I could explore moving on from Dropbox or changing teams even. And as the company was getting larger, I was already feeling that I was getting further away from both the craft of building a product, but also the craft of engineering. There's a point at large companies where being a middle manager, you learn a very different set of skills than necessarily building a product and building or being close to technology. And I think I was getting closer and closer to that point where I was getting really good at skills like managing up, managing sideways, being a really good communication layer between all my teams, and really just making sure we were executing effectively. But a lot of those were very soft skills, and I wanted to be closer to building the product and honing in my craft of product management as well as engineering. And
Yep.
I was getting further away from that. So I knew I wanted to go back to my roots, and my roots have always been like working with small teams, working on early products. And so I knew it was time to move on because I was starting to feel that way. And then when the opportunity arose, it was just at the right time that I was talking to one of the venture firms about potentially starting a company. And at that time, I was recommended to have dinner with Andrew because he was looking for someone to run engineering. Descript was really small. That dinner on a Monday night went to me accepting my offer on a Thursday morning. So it was a very quick turnaround because of
Wow.
how excited I got after talking to Andrew about his vision for the company.
Very cool. And so there's often, I think in startup land, there's often people that find themselves in a position of managing a technical team or building the tech team that never had an experience at a totally world-class place like Dropbox. I imagine there's some lessons that you took from Dropbox and applied to what you built at Descript. What would be the main ones that you think that you loved and copied and tried to apply where you are now?
Yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword. Like when you come from a company like Dropbox into a startup, you you know what good looks like at a particular scale. And you
Mhm.
almost have to like rewire your brain and your expectations on what good
Yeah.
is at a 12-person startup. For an
Yep.
example, when as a Dropbox, like a data loss incident would be a catastrophic problem, right? It would escalate all the way to VPs
Mhm.
and Drew would like pay attention to it, even when we were like 5 to 800 person company. And at Descript,
Mhm.
I remember my first week, one of the customers that we had a data loss incident. And it was this extremely emotional moment with the engineer on the call with the customer because they'd lost their data. And we, in a lot of ways, wanted to prevent that from happening, but we also knew that there's only so much time that we could spend on investing in the score part of the foundation. And for small
Mhm.
teams, largely they're trying to balance expanding their target market and foundational investments, especially around quality. And so the
Mhm.
thresholds are very different. Your levels of tolerance for quality is very, very different. Your
Yeah.
user base is very different because they might be more tech savvy and they're more tolerant to bugs. And so that was like an example where I had to really recalibrate myself to not
Yeah.
panic and understand what our quality bar is and make sure we're continually elevating it, but it was not the same thing as how we thought about it at Dropbox. But I think there were a lot of things that I felt like Dropbox did really well. Like I think Dropbox had a really strong performance management culture, did a very strong culture of giving feedback. And I think those are the individual, I want to say, parts of the culture that I brought to Descript that I think were really good ideas in retrospective.
I'm really glad you said that first point on recalibrating. And if I can be, I'll, this might be too Australian blunt, but I've seen exactly the same thing. And like I see it a lot with venture capitalists who they say they're speaking with earlier stage companies and they say, no, you need to hire the absolute best and really should just keep looking unless you find the best. And sometimes people need to realize like, hey, I'm not at the stage of company where I can attract the best. I need to take who's happy to come
Yeah.
here. Or at least, find something I can offer and offer that. But like generic advice sometimes from companies that are in a position like someone like Dropbox, it can sometimes be quite harmful because just very, very few companies are able to uh, offer what a company like Dropbox can.
Totally. And also I think best is very subjective, right? It's
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think when we were at Dropbox, like as we got larger, best largely meant that you were able to hire from places like the Fangs, right? And the reality is for
Yep.
most startups, that's usually not the best profile.
That's not the person.
And
Yeah.
I think
Yeah,
for a
for
lot of
sure.
people, they struggle with this. Like you hire people who've worked with only engineers from those companies, and they tend to like
Yeah.
only focus on hiring from those companies because in their mind, that's the best they can do. Right. But a lot of the
Yeah.
engineers that you want to hire at startups are people who love startups for what they are, right? They prioritize velocity.
Mhm.
They know how to take the right
Yep.
shortcuts and apply the right workarounds. They have a really good gauge for how much risk to take versus at a large company,
Yep.
you might not want to take any risk. There's generally not a lot of
Yeah.
appetite for risk. So I think it's hard. And this also happens when a company grows because sometimes like the old guards aren't quite a great fit for a company of a different scale.
Yeah.
And that's its own set of management issues. But
No, I mean, it's brutal because you definitely go through phases, and each company goes through phases at different speeds. If you're a hyperscale company, you're probably needing a new set of people every 6 months or something like that. But other companies, like you can have uh, a great team for 2 or 3 years and then just wake up and find out, oh, we've shifted in terms of a company and we need to bring in a different level. Or maybe like you were talking about, people that do the communication layer. Like in an early startup, you don't want a communication layer between the CTO and the software engineers, but at some point it becomes necessary.
exactly.
I think there's a shift happening on that front. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, which is how AI is going to impact everything. So in every one of these conversations, I'm asking everybody, how do you think AI is going to impact the way we work in the future? And the reason I say I'm interested in the makeup of teams is because some people think it changes the whole structure of how you build an engineering organization. Has that had an impact on you today? And do you think it's going to in the future?
Yeah. Let me start with talking about AI product development. And then there's another thread which is interesting around like how the way we work changes with AI. And if
Yeah.
that's of interest, we can go there as well. So for us, we've always been an AI company. We started off with this design paradigm that required AI in our product development process. But I would say, largely functioned like a traditional engineering organization that you've probably heard about at the larger FANG companies, where we had an AI research team that were a group of deep learning researchers building deep learning models. And then we had a platform team, and then we had product teams. And largely the way it would work is maybe a couple of times a year, we would have a new model on a problem that we're working on. And then the product teams, once the model was ready and we felt really good about the quality, the product teams would integrate it in. So we would maybe ship maybe 3 to 4 times a year when it came to a
Mhm.
breakthrough AI model. And I think since the rise of ChatGPT and large language models, things have changed completely, right? The pace of innovation is unparalleled, and there's a lot of, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of FOMO to ship AI features. And that's just how we're going to build software. Maybe not all of it, but a large percentage of it will just be using AI tools.
Mhm.
And so we've been moving in this direction of, instead of a centralized AI team, have a very decentralized AI presence across all of engineering, and then a very thin like platform team that enables and empowers product teams to build AI features. And so
Yeah.
we've been mostly thinking about it as like the mobile era, right? The way a
Yep.
lot of companies start with mobile is they start with a centralized team, which is like iOS and Android. And then as they expanded their effort there, mobile was part of every single team. Except there's one
Hmm.
difference here. Like mobile was a specific skill set that a lot of like you were a mobile engineer versus like a full
Yep.
stack engineer. And with AI, we think every single person needs to be able to work with LLMs. And so that's kind of
Yep.
the big incentive model we're moving towards at Descript.
Yeah. I think for the business world, I agree for the business world. I think it's something like the impact of Excel. It just became ubiquitous. Everybody could use it. It makes everybody more efficient. And it would be silly to ask somebody now, is your team powered by Excel? It's like, of course they use it.
Yep.
I feel like AI will have a similar impact. Um, is it changing at all? Uh, do you think it will change the job that software engineers do in the future?
I think so. I think both the combination of LLMs and AI models being a core part of product development. What's also changing is the tools that we all use, right? So whether you're using tools like GitHub Copilot, it's completely changing the workflow through which you go through to build software. And I think there is, I would say, a lot of resistance, more than I would have expected, in adopting these tools in a first principled way. I think very quickly you realize if you try to retrofit these tools within your current workflow, they don't seem to be all the way there. And the common criticism you'll hear from people that are using Gen AI tools is, well, it's not good enough yet. And so they are all waiting on the sidelines, or they're using it for very, very small parts of their workflow versus the people that are embracing it wholeheartedly. I see this with new grads who are like not used to a
Mhm.
workflow. They feel like they need to get started with Gen AI tools. They're creating complete new workflows around these tools, and they're actually using these tools a lot more effectively. So,
Give me some examples of what sort of things? Because I see that dynamic, the whole people play with that a little bit, then they're like, not super useful and go back to the old way they're doing things. So what are these new kids doing that's so different than that?
I think a lot of it is actually just being open to these tools. And
Mhm.
when you find imperfections, do you give up or do you actually creatively find a way around it?
Yeah.
Right? There's limitations to any tools that we use. And I think there's some people
Yep.
that are really excited about what this will enable. And a lot of people are in some ways skeptical. And
Yep.
there's also this dynamic, and I don't know how much of this is survivor bias. A lot of it is kind of scary because it's easy to feel like, well, will I have a job in 5 years or 10 years, right? If you're in customer support, if you're in marketing, it's becoming more and more evident that a lot of what you did isn't necessarily going to exist in its exact same flavor today. And so
Mhm.
I think that will improve productivity and that will change the way people work or what they actually spend time on. But I think that's really scary. So I think when you look at
Mhm.
tools like Devin, which are complete like agentic based software engineers,
Mhm.
and the kinds of instructions you're giving it is essentially just like a very detailed spec of what code you want to write. That's very different than like writing a class and thinking about the functions that you want to write and filling up the functions and actually thinking about
Mhm.
design principles and things like that, right? You're really, really moving up in the layer of abstraction in terms of the guidance that you need to give an AI agent. And so I think it's a very different way of thinking about problems where you're spending way more effort in the specification written in English to a chatbot
Mhm.
versus you're thinking a lot about like how all the pieces of the code come together. And I
Yep.
think that's a big change in workflow.
And one of my theories on why non-tech people or maybe very junior people or new entrants um, are so much more scared is that they haven't seen how difficult that step is,
Mm,
like that step to go up in abstraction. And break a problem down or design a good product spec for a problem, um, without seeing the difficulties in doing that, it's really hard to understand just how hard that is.
Yeah. That's actually a really good point. Like one of my favorite things to do was to have an intern when I was at Dropbox. And unlike most people who would give interns like problems that were palatable and that anyone could solve, and they wanted to make sure they were successful, I would actually give interns like problems that a lot of senior engineers had just given up or thought was really hard because, they
Mhm.
just knew a lot. And so they would be like, well, the
Yeah,
ROI is not worth it. This is going to be a long process. And sometimes you'd give these problems to an intern, and they would almost assume that if you're giving them a problem, it's obviously solvable.
it must be solvable. Yes.
Exactly. And they would actually, a lot of the times, come up with very clever solutions that would actually, like,
Yeah,
maybe sometimes not get us all the way, but get us pretty close that we were able to use in production.
yeah,
And so, there's a little bit of, I think sometimes we can all feel like very jaded when we know too much. And I think it's useful to have
yeah,
a complete fresh pair of eyes, and people who just are in some ways a little more optimistic and a little more,
yeah. And look, and not so calcified in how we do things. Like I'd never actually thought of it before, but I think your point on um, young people being more willing to find out how to solve a problem with an LLM is really interesting because it happened. You see it with every group of new people. The first time they run up against a problem, they find out how to work with that problem. But the people with a bit more experience, like, oh, I can already solve this using my old approach. So I'll just default back to my old approach, and so I can miss some steps.
yeah.
Look, I wanted then to cover off, to wrap up with uh, the question that you alluded to earlier, like in terms of hiring for your team, like the profile that you hire, or the amount of managers, or where you hire from, has that changed over the past few years? How do you like? Do you hire people in person, remote? Do you hire more junior, more senior? How do you think about building the right team for where you are at the moment?
So the first thing that I would say is it really, really depends on the product that you're building and what the needs of the
Mhm.
product are, right? And there's no silver bullet for a hiring strategy that works for everyone. I think like you alluded to, right? Generic
Yeah.
advice can cause as much harm can it can do good. And so for us, like one of the things I realized was, we were building this product that was going to take a long time to build. It took us almost 5 to 6 years to build out what we considered like a 1.0 of the product. So very similar to what we've heard about companies like Figma and Notion, where there was a long period of
Mhm.
building out the product and the foundation. And because that was true for us, we wanted to make sure that we were building things in a way that were extensible and essentially prudent in nature. And so we actually focused on hiring people who were like 4+ years of experience very earlier on because we realized that a lot of the things that we're building are foundational building blocks. And we have to keep building
Mhm.
on top. And we needed to build things in a way that were modular and were like easy to understand, and we're continuously building things for the long term. And this was after we'd found product market fit, and we were mostly looking to just build out the product, and we had extreme conviction in what we were trying to build. So
Mhm.
we largely focused on people who were, I would call like mid-level or higher. So people who have 3 to 4 years of experience or more. So we aren't teaching them like how to build software, but they're really coming in
Yeah.
to learn how to build larger systems and like how different pieces integrate together. The other piece for us was like we realized we required expertise in a lot of different areas. So, for us, like audio expertise was different from video. We needed some expertise
Mhm.
in like web and dealing with the niche things around how recording works on the web stack. Um, and just like the nuances of video and video formats. And so we needed people with some expertise or experience in a lot of distinct areas. And so, which is why we kind of kept a very small team, but we largely hired pretty senior. And our strategy was like, listen, we don't have a lot of time for mentorship at this stage, and we can attract great talent.
Mhm.
So let's just do that and keep the team as small as possible. So we don't have to pay the cost of
Mhm.
coordination and pay the cost of ramping people up and like kind of training them up for a long term. And we largely hired people who had worked at a startup before. So our
Mhm.
ideal candidate was someone who had both been at a startup and ideally also a large company. So they knew how to write quality code, but they also knew how to be scrappy and
I see the
resourceful,
difference. Yep.
and they can use good judgment to decide when they had to do what. But largely we biased towards hiring people who'd worked at startups. I think that became the key ingredient as we were looking for these people. And then as we've scaled, um, oh, and then all the early management team were people that were homegrown. Because when we were small, I felt like the risk to hire externally was too high as we were forming our culture. And I wanted to make sure that we created a culture of internal growth, also make sure that our stewards of culture were really kind of the first set of managers in the company. I also wanted to make sure they were technical, and I borrowed that playbook from Dropbox because I saw it work really well. Um, and so a lot of the managers at Descript even today are involved in a lot of technical decisions. They always review
That's good.
architectural documents, and they actually have a bias towards staying technical. I think that's really, really important. I find that a
Yep.
lot of managers like easily lose the craft that they manage and
Yep.
doesn't sound right. At that point, like you're a general manager who once knew how
Yep.
to code. So that's how we've scaled up. But we also had the luxury of not trying to grow more than 2x in any given year, which like companies
Yep.
might not have. So you might need a different strategy there.
And is your team, it doesn't look like you're in an office. Is your team remote at the moment, hybrid? We caught you on a sick day. Where's your team located?
Yeah, so we used to be a 100% in-person culture when I joined, and then the pandemic hit, and we were initially very opposed to hybrid. We dreaded every day, and we were unhappy about like not being able to see each other and tap on each other's shoulder and just be able to talk about problems.
Mhm.
And then very quickly, we started doing surveys as offices were opening up with people. And we realized that a couple of things had happened. Some people had just moved further away because they realized that they could have a much higher quality of life by being able to buy a house with a nice backyard. A lot of people had kids during the pandemic, and now they suddenly had young kids at home that they wanted to spend time on. They'd all gotten used to not commuting an hour each way, and they'd
Yeah.
realized the quality of
Yeah.
life difference that they suddenly had. And unlike a few of us that were either like single people who lived in the city and really loved the city life and had very short commutes, we realized a lot of people actually preferred to work from home and strongly preferred.
Mhm.
And there were benefits for people to like work from home. And we did see some gaps, and we still see, but we've largely feel good about having a hybrid work policy. So we have an office in San Francisco for people who live in San Francisco and don't have enough office space, an ergonomic desk environment at home that they want to just come in and like use the office as a working space. But all work happens in a remote friendly way. It happens over Zoom. Um, Me as someone who leads the engineering team, like works from home like maybe 3 to 4 times a week because I want to
Mhm.
live that reality. I want to go into the office and see how it feels when someone else is remote, and I also want to be remote so that I can uncover my blind spots when we're drifting too far apart, biasing towards one crowd
Yep.
or the other.
Like I love the constant theme runs through everything you do, which is eat your own dog food.
Mhm.
Keep your managers technical. Take advice from companies like yours. Um, Tell you, man, that'll wrap us up for today. And look, really, uh, it's super rare I have a conversation like this, and I just wanted to um, call it out because I think Ravello's journey has not been a stereotypical one, and it's been one of the things that has most stuck out to me is those just standard rules that everyone applies don't work for every company. Like each company is different and you need to adapt to your own company. So it's been really fascinating. I've really enjoyed how on every decision you've made, how you've thought through, okay, what's my company, what's the situation of my company at this point in time? And so what's the best decision based on it? Like, it's a really great way of thinking and surprisingly rare. So really fascinating conversation, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me.